historic National Convention of Opposition Party Leaders is taking place next month. We get an update from the DA's Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Mr. Leon Schreiber. Welcome, Leon.
Great to be here.
How many opposition party leaders are attending the National Convention?
At the moment, we have 6 parties who are involved in this process. That is the DA, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, the United Independent Movement, and also the Spectrum National Party. It may be the case that 1 or 2 still join before the convention takes place, but that's really the core 6 parties that are currently involved in this process.
Were all the potentially allianced opposition parties invited, or not everybody?
I think there were about 15 different organizations that were invited initially. This goes back to the Congress speech made by DA leader John Steyn at the beginning of April. And after that, there was correspondence, as I say, with about 15 parties. The Pact, really, as it is taking shape, is meant to provide an alternative to the ANC. First of all, an alternative in terms of actual governance. So this is an attempt to form this kind of cooperation based on values that are different from what we've seen implemented in South Africa over the last few decades. So that sort of core commitment to things like non-racialism, the rule of law, zero tolerance for corruption, accountability, and a capable state free from cadre deployment are really the kind of essential building blocks for this project. So obviously, where you have parties that would be working with the ANC or that are mired in corruption allegations, for example, those are parties that would not actually be providing an alternative to the ANC, and in many cases, we would regard them as actually being alternative versions of the ANC. And so there are a couple of parties. You can think about Good, for example, the Patriotic Alliance, Jama-Ah, currently working with the ANC in various spheres. Some of them mired in corruption allegations who are not part of this process, precisely because we really want it to be an alternative to the ANC. I think linked to that, also important that we want this to be a credible alternative. So we want this to be a genuine commitment and agreement from parties to actually govern differently from what the ANC has done, but also then to go out and really focus on winning over more voters. Specifically, I think focused on the 27 million voters who are either not registered or who are not voting. That is a massive pool of potential, and that the credible alternative would focus on winning over those voters rather than sort of squabbling internally and fighting with each other. That's really the credibility, and then, as I say, really important that the parties in this pact offer an alternative to the ANC, and we're quite confident of that.
Well, as we've seen, coalitions can go horribly wrong. So obviously you are looking for coalition partners you can trust and will not turn when you most need them.
Indeed. And when, we have examples of parties that have flip-flopped their positions between essentially the opposition and the ANC. And I think that demonstrates all that needs to be said about those parties in the sense that they do not actually provide that kind of credible alternative. But I think more broadly, the pact and this process is very much proof that parties are learning out of the coalition experiences. I would hasten to add that there are coalitions in this country that are working. I think about the relationship between the DA and the IFP as an especially encouraging one in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, where there are 13 municipalities where we are working together and steadily fixing the damage caused by the ANC. So it's not the case that all coalitions have failed, but certainly there have been cases of severe challenges. And it is in response to those that really this convention that is set to take place next month is quite a hopeful development, because there are a number of issues with coalitions that are structural in nature and that we hope to address at this convention. The first one being the fact that you would only have 2 weeks to negotiate a coalition government after the 2024 election. That is an impossible deadline to impose on a political process. We know from countries that have had decades of experience with coalitions that it can take months to actually form them. So in response to that particular structural constraint, we are seeking to essentially front load the negotiations. We want to see what we can agree on ahead of the election, so that when that moment comes to form a coalition government, we're actually in a position with a head start, essentially, to then tackle the remaining issues in those 2 weeks. So that's really, I think, a mature response to one of the lessons we've learned. The other is, of course, that you would often have heavy contestation around positions when it comes time to forming what we hope will be a pact government next year.
Everybody wants to be president. Yeah.
Right. And so, even if it's not only about the president, it's also about positions in cabinet or, executives, portfolio committees, those kind of things. So from the DA side, we really hope that we can exit the convention with an agreed upon formula for how we would actually constitute a pact government. Now, this doesn't have to go into enormous detail, but I think it is useful because it is something that parties will actually agree to upfront. In other words, it's a formula that could be adopted before the election result is known, which theoretically would make it a little bit easier after the election, because it's something that was agreed upon ahead of time before we knew exactly how the dice would fall. So that's another example, I think, of how this process is quite encouraging and showing that parties are learning from the coalition experience, and not only talking about it, but actually now taking this firm step in trying to sort out some of these issues ahead of the election.
Have you drawn up a final agenda yet for discussion?
I don't think the agenda is necessarily final, but most of it is already there. So there's a lot of consensus about the issues that we would like to tackle at the convention. Some of them I've mentioned, but we would have to look at, obviously, the values and principles that would bring together a pact government, because it's really important that this is not only seen to be an anti-ANC project. We obviously understand that the ANC has been in power and really is the root political cause of South Africa's problems, but simply saying that is not enough. We want this also to be a pact that is not only against something, but also for something. And this is where the discussion about values and principles that we can agree on is important. A second element of the agenda would be a minimum program that says, should a government be constituted out of this pact, we would be looking to implement this a certain set of policy solutions to the 5 or 10 biggest problems in South Africa. And here are the things that we actually agree on. Now, I think it's important to say that political parties will obviously retain their individual identities. They will be able to go out and campaign on a policy proposition that will be more comprehensive than what may come out of the convention. So that is for voters to go and actually decide then which of the particular parties they would like to support. The DA would obviously say to voters that, if we want this government to work, we need a strong, stable party to anchor this arrangement, and also one that has a demonstrated track record of good governance. And so that is the kind of offer that we would make as a political party that will go beyond the minimum program. But I think it is important for that minimum program to give voters the confidence that this is not something that is just being done as an anti-ANC project, but that it actually can address the issues that matter to them. So those are really some of the key items on the agenda: values and principles, minimum program of action, a formula to constitute a government, all things that I think we've never seen before in South Africa from the opposition. And I think it's something that ought to really encourage opposition voters and disillusioned voters to realize here is actually something happening that will provide a real alternative to the ANC, and that is very exciting.
What percentage of the vote do you think the coalition bloc could hope to get?
We need 50% plus one. It's not even a matter of hope. That is what our goal needs to be. In the 2021 election, the group of parties currently involved in this process got about 35% of the vote. So we would need to grow by 15 percentage points. But I think this is also part of the beauty of this process. We, as I said earlier, should not be focusing on fighting amongst the opposition. We should stop the petty squabbling. And we should stop talking about things that, frankly, may seem to matter a lot to politicians, but don't matter at all to the people. And this is something that the convention and the pact can really help with in terms of reorienting opposition politics. So instead of fighting each other, we all need to go out and find ways of growing so that we can collectively get to the 15%. And I think, and I'm hopeful, that once voters realize that for the very first time since 1994, there's not only a very, very real prospect of the ANC losing its majority nationally, but also in provinces like Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, but that there also is now a real vision of an alternative government that can come to power, that will really enthuse disillusioned voters. And in that way, we could have a political rising tide that lifts all boats. In other words, all of these parties, part of the pact, need to actually grow. We shouldn't be in a situation where we want one party to grow and the other to shrink because, or to shuffle the deck chairs, because then we're not going to get to 50% plus one. We all have a responsibility to go out, find voters who are unregistered, find voters who are disillusioned, and make sure that each of our individual parties grow into that 15 percentage point that we need. From the DA's point of view, I can say to you, we are absolutely committed to that. We've recently had a series of by-elections that shows that we are certainly growing. We have won back an outright majority in George after winning 2 out of 3 wards that were previously held by Good. In the round of by-elections before that, we grew from Cape Town to eThekwini to Tshwane with really substantial numbers. And so that is our focus. And that is what we want to bring to the pact, is to say we want to grow by a significant percentage so that we add to that 15 percentage points. And we really hope that that would be the approach of other parties as well.
So at one stage, there were about 13 million voters still not registered. Do you know how many of those have registered? Is there uptick?
Well, at the moment, the numbers we have or are working with is about 14 million not registered and another 13 million who are registered but who didn't vote in 2021. So that brings us actually to a potential pool of 27 million voters. Now, if you take into account the fact that the ANC in 2021 got only 5.3 million votes, then you start to see the potential of this project, because if we can get even 10% or maybe 20% of that 27 million to actually come out and support this project, then we will be well on our way to actually beating the ANC. Those are the hard numbers that are involved here. And I think that it's something that is absolutely doable. I wouldn't be able to say right now what the numbers look like, because we obviously have the big registration weekend that is coming later this year, ahead of the national election. And I think that will give us a first real indication of whether we are actually succeeding in enthusing voters to come back into the political process. But really, it is all to play for in this election. And that's why the DA has referred to this as a moonshot election for South Africa. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done if we all pull together and focus in a single-minded way on the goal. And the goal really should be to get those 27 million voters back into the political process and win over disillusioned ANC voters who have for a long time thought, well, there's no real alternative here, so I'll stick with what I know. This time around, we really want to change the game completely and say we have a very credible alternative at exactly the moment that you need one, if you look at the state of South Africa.
A bit of a tricky question. What if the ANC fares so badly in the election that it has to choose a coalition partner to stay in government, and it has to choose between your coalition pact and the EFF? What will happen then? What will you guys do?
Well, the first scenario that we would obviously want if the ANC loses its majority is for the pact to get its own majority. So if the ANC dips below 50, we want it to be far enough below 50 so that we collectively get to 50% plus one. But obviously, if that does not happen at national level, the important thing to say is that it may still happen in a number of provinces. We have the latest polling at our disposal showing that these parties collectively are sitting around 48% in Gauteng and around 44% in KwaZulu-Natal already. And so even if it doesn't happen at national level, those provinces are very much in play. But to answer the question of, that hypothetical scenario, I think it's really important at that stage that we go back to the voters. Because what we are saying to voters with this pact is that this is the DA's first choice. And this is the first choice and really the only choice for every party involved in this project. We want to bring this alternative government into being next year. We don't want to work with the ANC. We don't want to work with the EFF. We've been absolutely clear about that. If voters don't actually make that possible, in other words, if voters don't come out in such numbers that we get the 50% plus one, I think it's really something we will have to take back to the voters and say to them, our first choice was clear. It hasn't happened that way. Now we need voters to actually tell us what the next best or possibly least worst alternative will be. So that is really a commitment that from the DA side, we will make very clear upfront that if this pact does not get where we want it to get, we will go back to the voters, we will consult with the people of South Africa and essentially get direction from them. Do they want an ANC-EFF government? Do they want negotiations with parties outside of the pact? That's really a question that we will go back to the voters with.
Thank you, Mr. Schreiber. That was Leon Schreiber of the DA talking to BizNews about opposition party leaders meeting at a national convention next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.